on the common link theory by Alhomoudi. It is explicitly stated by Ahmed ibn Hanbal in Al-Ilal wal-Ma'rifat al-Rijal that Ammar ibn Sayf said, Sufyan's books were in my possession. Since these books likely contain many of Sufyan's hadiths, many transmitters of Tubna Medina could have logically assumed that it was originally narrated by him. Because it was difficult or impossible for later transmitters to meet with Sufyan himself for the purpose of transmitting hadiths. It is reasonable to infer that they visited Ammar for many of Sufyan's hadiths. There were two periods when transmitters reportedly sought Sufyan's hadiths from Ammar. One was during the period when Sufyan was hiding from the Abbasid caliphs, which was 140 to 160, and the other was immediately after Sufyan's death, which was 161. Muhaddiths realized this and thus advised transmitters not to record or narrate Sufyan's hadiths from any source unless they had been heard from Sufyan directly. For example, one of the transmitters, Yusuf ibn Sa'id, asked Khalaf ibn Tamim, who was the most reliable transmitter in Kufa among Sufyan's students, from whom should one copy Sufyan's hadith? Khalaf replied, do not narrate anything from Sufyan except what you have heard from him yourself. This statement of Khalaf confirms that there were transmitters who would fabricate hadiths and link them to Sufyan. In fact, Khalaf indicated specifically Ammar's hadith Tubna al-Madina and affirmed that Ammar had narrated it once via Asim directly and once via Asim via Sufyan. In other words, Khalaf wanted to demonstrate that Ammar had fabricated this report and integrated it into Sufyan's hadiths. Having looked in some detail at this strand of the isnad from Ammar, there remained two other separate strands that were transmitted from the companion Anas, as illustrated by the following diagram. However, Juynboll confused these two strands by combining them as if they showed the same isnad. Whether Juynboll did this deliberately or inadvertently as a result of the complexity of this field of study, his methodological approach was wrong, because the isnads are to be distinguished by the companions who narrated the hadith, not by the later transmitters in the isnad. Obviously, as stated by Khatib in Tarikh Baghdad, the hadith of Anas does not strengthen the isnad, but rather weakens it. Comparing the hadith via Anas to the one via Jarir, Al-Khatib states, the hadith via Anas does not outnumber the hadith by Jarir. It was moreover transmitted by only two transmitters, Salih ibn Bayan, a weak transmitter of the 8th rank, and Hammam ibn Muslim, who was anonymous of the 10th rank. Therefore, the hadith via Anas has two problems. First, the weakness of its transmitters, and second, that they are outnumbered by the transmitters of Jarir's hadith. Overall, having two problematic isnads tends to weaken rather than strengthen a hadith's case. In addition to the hadith Tubna Medina, Juynboll presents another hadith that is considered less self-evident, but nonetheless sufficiently interesting of an example of tradition whose isnads seem to have a common link. This example is the legal maxim concerning the amount of dowry. After presenting the different strands of this isnad, Juynboll concludes that Ibn Adi held Mubashir responsible for spreading this hadith, that is, of being the common link. See diagram. However, Juynboll draws two conclusions from analysing this hadith and from Ibn Adi's quotation. A. That the common link is a phenomenon that must have struck the imagination of medieval Muslim hadith experts, and B. That they never developed this idea any further than merely hinting at it in the case of suspicious hadith forgers or in allusions to certain key figures. The approach to hadith clearly distinguishes between Juynboll and the Muhaddith's understanding of the common link phenomenon. The Muhaddiths acknowledge its existence and accuse transmitters with questionable reputations of playing this role and fabricating hadiths, as is the case of the hadith of Jarir concerning the dowry, for which Mubashir was the common link. Meanwhile, Juynboll accuses even trustworthy Muhaddiths of being the common link, holding them responsible for fabrication. Surprisingly, Juynboll, without providing evidence, decides a Sha'abi who has a rank of integrity as the probable originator of the maxim. Juynboll refers to the hadith narrated by Ali to prove that Sha'abi is the common link in the hadith of Jabir. This bizarre conclusion affirms that Juynboll's analyses are not sufficient. Towards the end of this section, Juynboll dedicates the common link theory. He provides the following summary. It could be maintained that the relative rarity of clear-cut examples of common link mean that it deserves no more of our attention than at most that given to a bizarre but uncommon phenomenon. After evaluating Juynboll's support for the common link theory, we conclude that it ultimately undermines rather than supports Schacht's argument. Examination of Juynboll's treatment of Tubna Medina proves the inadequacy of his methodology as compared to that of the traditionists. The evidence clearly points to a weak and unreliable transmitter within the isnad of this hadith. The existence of the common link as a general phenomenon does not therefore pose any significant challenge to the authenticity of transmission, and so Juynboll's argument would amount to very little at the end of the day. Having established the faultiness of Schachtian evidence for the CLT, it is clear that applying their theory to any other hadith would result in the same mistakes, in mislocating the actual person responsible for spreading the tradition in question, and failing to consult the proper sources. Schachtian scholars were led to inaccurate conclusions. More importantly, the root of the flaws in these conclusions is an unawareness of how traditionists articulate the common link. This question will be addressed in the following chapter. Stay tuned.